American Meteorological Society's policy program is supported, in part, by a public-private partnership.
And communications for us is huge. So this is actually the launch of a big plan that we're doing around preparedness. We recognize that we did all this great analysis, we did all this great plan, but then what are we doing to actually get people engaged and involved at the community level?
So our third speaker is Kristin Baja. She's the Climate and Resilience Planner with the Office of Sustainability at Baltimore City. She is responsible for the development and implementation of the city's Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan, which integrates climate adaptation with hazard mitigation efforts. She is also responsible for climate change communication and outreach, the Community Rating System certification, resiliency planning, and STAR Communities certification. Kristin.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to give you a little bit more of the local perspective. We're just up the way from you a little bit, and tell a little bit more about how some of this modeling is being used on the ground and what we've actually been doing in Baltimore City. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the recent events that we've had, and also what we've done then after those events or throughout those events to develop a plan, and how we're working on implementing that plan right now, and then some of the communication efforts related to that plan as well. So some of our recent events. This is actually a picture of April 30th, 2014, where we had a landslide that took out our CSX rail line and also evacuated 20 homes for over 40 days. This was from a rain event. So we have a lot of non-tidal flooding in Baltimore City. It means it's not the coastal flooding. We're at the base of 4 major watersheds. We also sit right on the Chesapeake Bay. So we get this heavy precipitation, what we're calling cloudbursts. Molly referred a little bit more to these really heavy precipitation events that we're seeing more frequently. We have 2 very good examples from this past year. On the left side is an August 12th flood in which we had 9 inches of rain in South Baltimore in a very short period of time. But it was a very interesting cell where it was just in South Baltimore. In North Baltimore, we got less than 4 inches. So it was very interesting the way that it just hammered that one spot, and it also really significantly impacted the airport. So if anybody was flying out of BWI that day or had a car sitting in long-term parking, you came back to it completely underwater. On the right side is a picture of that event on April 30th where we had the landslide. You can see how CSX rail came in and immediately got the rail cleared because they were losing $50,000 an hour with having that happen. And then we are working on now putting that retaining wall back in. Those same events have led to a lot of our historic mill impacts, a lot of impacts to our infrastructure. So we had a lot of overwhelming of our underground stormwater infrastructure as well as our sewage overflow. We had some areas where we had significant transportation infrastructure. So here we have a Monument Street sinkhole that's actually opened up 6 times. We've been unable to continue to keep that hole from opening up. Also, the debris here on the right, we have a lot of debris that comes down at the same time and collects, and that backs up the water and creates even a worse situation. So these are sort of the non-tidal flooding events that we're dealing with being at the same time as what we're dealing with tidal flooding. And as you've heard, this area is really expected to see some of the greatest increase in flood frequency. Baltimore, Annapolis, and DC being 3 of those cities that are really going to see a lot more of these tidal events. We're anticipating going from 17 to 30 days right now of tidal flooding to 227 tidal flooding events in a year. That's going to be by 2045. That's a big, significant change in what we're trying to start working on. This is actually an image of Hurricane Isabel in 2003. These are our downtown areas in Baltimore City. So if anybody has been downtown, that's the World Trade Center in Baltimore. That's the big tall building that we have right downtown. And that building actually became a bathtub during that storm surge. They had a 10-foot wall that they thought was going to protect all their infrastructure. With the storm surge and the fact that it happened at a high tide, it actually became a bathtub and a holding place for all the water. And the World Trade Center was out for an entire month. As well as you can see some of our emergency systems trying to get around and also having a hard time with some of our transportation infrastructure there. So all of this is nuisance flooding in a way for us, where we're constantly seeing impacts to the city all around. We're seeing impacts to our transportation. We had 895 closed during that August 12th event, as well as many tunnels because the entire roadway was covered. Our stormwater infrastructure obviously being overwhelmed. Unfortunately, in Baltimore, we still have wooden pipes in some areas. Things we're trying to upgrade right now, but it is a factor that we're dealing with as a very old city. Also, the fact that we're bulkheaded to a certain place, but also we have some very low-lying historic areas that are already pretty much at that high tide level. And as Molly was also talking about, we have those pipes where the water's coming back up and flooding in areas that we weren't historically seeing flooding before. And then for us, the storm surge is also a big factor. So we actually did some modeling with FEMA. Our biggest storm surge to date was Hurricane Isabel in 2003, where we had the 7.5-foot surge. But with Sandy, we did a little bit of experimental modeling to look at what that would have looked like had Sandy turned a little sooner. Our surge would have been 3 times that, if not a bit greater. So that's a big thing for both DC and Baltimore. It would have impacted this area significantly. And this I would have put in the beginning, but these are just a view so you can get a greater understanding of our watersheds and where we fall along the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see we have water that's coming up along the Chesapeake Bay as well as water coming down from those 4 watersheds. So flooding is a huge issue for our city. So what are we doing about that? We saw, obviously, we're having a lot of events. We know that these events are taking place. What our approach was is to take a FEMA document that's required for most municipalities to get pre-disaster mitigation funding, and that's called the All Hazard Mitigation Plan. That looks at all hazards that a city is facing, so that's heat, flooding, sea level rise. We even put air quality in there. And instead of just looking at historical impacts and historical approaches, we also decided to integrate a climate adaptation plan. So also using some of the modeling that is coming out right now, a lot of the work that Jamie just put out, unfortunately, was not there at the time when we put this together, but now we're going to try to integrate it into the plan. And that's overall helping us with creating a more resilient city. So just to get an idea of what hazards are in this plan, even though we're focusing on flooding today, we're looking at coastal storms, nor'easters, wind, extreme heat, and drought. Yes, drought, even though we're a water-rich area right now, it's something we're starting to plan ahead for. And really, as you can see, a lot of these things, when we were doing mapping, they're getting more severe, more extensive, or more intense. So our process was really to do a risk assessment, to go through and identify all these hazards, identify their historical impacts, what we've actually seen economically, socially, environmentally, do a vulnerability assessment, so overlay a lot of those data layers with our economic and social layers and determine areas that are going to be most vulnerable. We did a lot of modeling with this program and then also integrated some weaknesses into our impacts assessment when we were looking at critical facilities and critical areas. Lastly, we developed a plan, and that plan has 1 guiding vision, 6 goals, 50 strategies, and 231 actions that are guiding the work that we're doing in implementation right now. With most of these plans, an all hazard mitigation plan is actually typically structured by the hazard. That we found was actually something that historically has not helped our city at all. We do not have the Department of Heat. We don't have the Department of Sea Level Rise. It's just not the way that most cities are able to implement a lot of things. So we created a different structure, working with both FEMA and the state in agreement to change it up a bit and look at these 4 main categories: infrastructure, buildings, natural systems, and public services, and then looking at each of those categories and creating sort of implementation steps and timelines, and also identifying lead agencies and stakeholders associated with each of them so that we can move directly into implementation instead of trying to identify who's going to do what now because this is how we're being impacted by heat. There was also a lot of modeling that we did. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, Jamie's excellent models weren't available for us in 2012. This modeling is stuff that we're continuing to update and use as we go along, but we did create depth grids, looked a lot at wind, sea level rise, storm surge in the work that we were doing. So this is just an image quickly of the cover of the plan. It was adopted in October of 2013. It's called the Disaster Preparedness Project and Plan, very long, but we call it DP3 for short, and it also makes our mayor sound really excited about preparedness when she talks about it. And it's just laid out where we have the strategies at the top and then all the actions listed as well as the stakeholders. Another big piece of this is we did a huge crosswalking process of part of this plan where we looked at all of our city's existing plans and projects and then identified how they overlap with the 50 strategies and 231 actions in our plan so that we can enhance existing projects and plans so that we're not going in and saying you have to change or do something different in your department, but you can add this to bring this existing project up to where we want to be. So we had a huge advisory committee for this. There was a 40-person advisory committee, and that's only because I got capped by the mayor's office at a 40-person advisory committee. We had a lot of representation from our other city agencies, from the state, from the feds, as well as a lot of our NGOs and our local neighborhood groups. We also, though, went above and beyond that and said, well, we have some really special interest groups that need to also be involved, but there are too many stakeholders in those groups. So the Port of Baltimore brings in $52 billion a year in through that port. We met with the Port, the 45 people who wanted to come and meet with us multiple times about the considerations with the Port. We met with our developers and a lot of our building owners along the waterfront. So we met with a lot of our neighborhood groups. And so it was a pretty extensive outreach effort. We did a ton of community engagement as well. These all hazard mitigation plans only require 2 meetings, 2, for you to have throughout the entire process of development. Well, we have a lot of people who can't make it to a community meeting downtown. They have kids, they can't get there, there's no transportation, or it's too late. So we actually went to the areas that we mapped that were most vulnerable and actually volunteered to come to people's homes, to come to their neighborhood community meetings and allow them to get engaged. And you can see us in some of these meetings in the top there, actually inside people's homes with our computers, showing them the models and how it's going to impact them and showing them how their houses will be impacted. So we had over 15 of those other meetings, which were really nice because everybody felt like they were part of the process. We also provided free busing to when we had the bigger town hall events that brought in not only folks that are going to be most vulnerable in the most vulnerable areas, but those that may not have access to transportation. We provided free childcare and free food, which was usually the barriers to get people involved. So what are we doing with implementation? This is actually a picture of our solar power water wheel at the base of the Jones Falls. That's one of those major watersheds and where we actually have a lot of debris during a storm come down. You will see mattresses sometimes floating there. I'm not joking. So this is a solar powered water wheel that now collects a lot of that debris and puts it into a trash bin at the back that gets removed so that at the end of a storm, the inner harbor is not the most disgusting place you've ever seen. But we are prioritizing, and we're prioritizing with the crosswalk that I showed you earlier, as well as work around climate mitigation, so efforts to lower greenhouse gas emissions, as well as work that we're doing in this plan, so the adaptation hazard mitigation work. All of you are very intelligent people. These are the kind of overlaps that we're seeing, drinking water, renewable energy, energy efficiency, transportation, et cetera. Some of the big things that we've been able to implement thus far before executive order, I think it's 11998 or 988, we actually decided to upgrade our floodplain ordinance to regulate to the 500-year floodplain. We also have a 2-foot freeboard. So this is stricter than most other areas in the state of Maryland. We do that in both the tidal and the non-tidal areas. So the 500-year floodplain and the riverine is a really big change, and we've had a lot of big a lot of feedback on that hasn't always been the most exciting. We also are working on a process right now to become a community rating system, which means that we're looking to lower insurance rates for every single person who's in our special flood hazard area by getting basically points. It's called the lead, basically, of flood insurance. So some of the things we're doing around the floodplain have been really big and also are guiding a lot of the development along the waterfront right now. In fact, I just had a permit come in the other day where they're doing this really great, wonderful landscaping with bioswales to try to deal with water and lifting up the fact that they need to be 15 feet higher than they originally thought. Critical infrastructure is also something we're really focusing on, and critical communities. So this is actually an area called Fells Point. Maybe you've been there before. It's one of our historic districts, and this is an area that's really the most vulnerable community that we have to tidal flooding. It's already underwater most of the time. So we are looking at infrastructure in that area and how we're going to upgrade infrastructure in that area. We're also looking at simple things. So believe it or not, most of the area there does not have backflow preventers on it, which are the big things that make sure the water does not go back up into the community. So very simple strategies, but also some bigger strategies where we are going to see the water go up and over the bulkhead more often. Are there options for these flood walls? I personally prefer the ones that turn into benches rather than the ones we have to go and put in, but those are some of the strategies that we're looking at. And this is just kind of a idea, or gives you an idea of what we're looking at with both tidal flooding and precipitation flooding and different options that we have along the waterfront, and then sort of the costs that we're looking at associated with those. None of these have actually been things that we've decided to do 100%, except the backflow preventers, because they're the lowest cost, obviously, but we're still looking at some other options. Another big thing that we're doing is a whole block approach. So we're looking at creating more resilient neighborhoods. So this is not solely around flooding, it's actually looking at all of our different hazards. But instead of taking certain initiatives that are focused on energy and energy efficiency or stormwater and stormwater management, we're actually overlaying all of those together and coming into a community and trying to do upgrades throughout. That's looking at cool roofs, weatherization, energy efficiency education, trees and greening, vacant lots and reusing some of our vacant lots. And that keys directly into a big initiative that we just launched called the Growing Green Initiative. So Baltimore actually has 16,000 vacant lots. That's quite a lot, and usually those have been seen as pretty detrimental to the city and the way it's seen. We're actually trying to use those as assets now. So what can we do with those vacant lots to use them for stormwater management, urban agriculture, community managed open spaces, creating more tree canopy. So we actually have 7 pilot projects right now that we're working on implementing throughout the city that are gonna help us with some of this stormwater and also containing some of the surge that we'll get in some of the areas along the waterfront. And communications for us is huge. So this is actually the launch of a big plan that we're doing around preparedness. We recognize that we did all this great analysis, we did all this great plan, but then what are we doing to actually get people engaged and involved at the community level? So we launched something called Make a Plan, Build a Kit, Help Each Other. That was last April. I get a little bit more excited about it, so I talk a little bit faster. But basically what we're doing is working with people in the moment to create emergency plans. Get them thinking about what medications they're taking, where their nearest hospital is, what their evacuation route is. If they don't own a car, how are they going to evacuate? Do they have a neighbor they should be checking in on? There's a lot of questions that we ask that they put on a sheet and they keep it themselves and they put it inside the next piece, which is their emergency kit. And we just don't hand out a kit. We actually sit and go through every single piece that's in a kit that we're providing them, including the hand crank radios and the water bladders and the dust masks and all those pieces, and explain how they'll be used and in which hazard they should be used. And then we explain the things that we're not able to provide that people should start to collect, like the food or extra clothes. So this is some pictures of our launch. We also taught free CPR at this launch. We're offering free community emergency response team training and also doing a lot with showing people sort of a lot of the modeling, but in a much more simplistic way. Also, Baltimore City is a city of row houses and also a very vulnerable area. We have a lot of low-income residents in our neighborhoods, and a lot of people will lose access to power pretty quickly. And so the ability to communicate in those row house communities where maybe we're not able to get to them as quickly, we created something called the Help Safe sign. It's more of a community thing, but you put it in your window to say if you're safe or if you need help, and then we're identifying community leaders to go through and actually identify if people do need assistance or not. It's simplistic, I understand, but a lot of people do not have those landline phones anymore. And we also find that with the derecho that we had in 2012, at the same time as our big heat wave, we had people without response for 7 to 10 days. That's a huge issue for us on an emergency management side, but also we want to make sure these communities have a greater capacity to adapt and respond on their own. We have a lot of local partners that we're working with. I won't list them all, but I will mention that we're doing a lot of work with them in implementing a lot of these projects. We're also working with a lot of local universities for tracking a lot of this information. So as we're going through and implementing the whole block approach, we actually have little urban heat island sensors that we're working with Johns Hopkins University to put in to track the reduction in heat over time as we're putting in more trees, thinking about stormwater, all those different pieces. And then also I mentioned our business and industrial community has been really engaged. Lastly, we're really integrating this at all levels. So our capital improvements process has also been a key part for us to deal with this at sort of the mayoral level. and ensure that any other agency that is asking for money to do a capital improvement, they have to explain how that's making the city more resilient. How are they considering climate change or climate adaptation, and how are they integrating these bigger storms, the bigger events into their plans? So that's been a big piece for us, and that's all I have. Just so you know, Turtle is actually our sustainability and resiliency mascot. It's a 6.5-foot turtle that comes with us to a lot of events, so that's why Turtle's there.